Most people think survival is a calculated choice. It isn't. When the front windows of a diner shatter under a hail of automatic gunfire, you don't think, you react. I was just a waitress holding a pot of decaf, trying to make rent. He was just an old man eating a slice of cherry pie in booth 4, when I threw my body over his, smelling the gunpowder and waiting for a bullet to tear through my spine. I thought I was saving a helpless grandfather. I was dead wrong. I had just saved Salvatore Rossi, the most feared syndicate boss in the city, and by sunrise, his ruthless heir would claim my life as his own. The air inside the Rusty Spoon always smelled of burnt filter coffee, old fryer grease, and quiet desperation. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3:15 p.m., the dead zone between the late lunch crowd and the early dinner rush. Rain lashed against the large, smudged front windows, blurring the grey Chicago streets into a watercolor of urban misery. Daniel Jenkins wiped down the Formica counter for the 4th time in an hour, her shoulder aching. At 24, she carried the exhaustion of a woman twice her age. Her younger sister, Lily, had cystic fibrosis, and the medical bills stacked on Daniel's kitchen table were a constant, ticking clock. Daniel worked double shifts, subsisted on diner leftovers, and prayed the collection agencies would give her 1 more month. The bell above the door chimed, cutting through the low hum of the ancient refrigerator. An old man walked in. He shook a black umbrella, collapsing it with a practiced flick of his wrist. He was dressed impeccably, out of place in a neighborhood where most people wore faded workwear. His charcoal wool overcoat draped over a tailored 3-piece suit. He had a silver cane with a carved wooden handle, and his eyes, though lined with age, were sharp and entirely alert. "Booth 4, sweetheart," Brenda, the diner's owner, rasped from the grill, not even turning around. Usual. Daniel grabbed a menu, though she knew he wouldn't need it, and walked over to the corner booth. The old man smiled as she approached. It was a warm, grandfatherly smile that crinkled the corners of his dark eyes. "Good afternoon, Mr. Rossi," Daniel said, pulling out her order pad. "Black coffee and a slice of the cherry pie." "You have a wonderful memory, Daniel," Salvatore Rossi said, his voice a gravelly baritone with the faintest trace of an old-world Italian accent. "And how is little Lily doing? Did the new medication help with the coughing?" Daniel blinked, touched. He had asked about Lily a few weeks ago, and she was surprised he remembered. "She's managing. Thank you for asking. I'll get your pie." She retreated behind the counter, cutting a generous slice of pie and pouring the dark roast. As she walked back toward booth 4, the heavy, oppressive silence of the afternoon was shattered. It started with the screech of tires. A matte black SUV jumped the curb, its front bumper slamming into the diner's newspaper stand. Daniel froze, the coffee pot in her right hand, the plate in her left. The doors of the SUV flew open. 3 men stepped out, wearing heavy tactical jackets and black ski masks. In their hands were matte black submachine guns. Time dilated. Daniel saw the rain bouncing off the metal barrels of the guns. She saw the men lock eyes with the back of Salvatore Rossi's head. "Down!" Daniel screamed. She dropped the coffee pot. It shattered, sending scalding liquid splashing across her ankles, but she didn't feel it. Without thinking, without calculating the odds or her own survival, Daniel vaulted over the low partition, dividing the counter from the dining area. She lunged toward booth 4. The first volley of bullets tore through the front window. The glass exploded inward in a deadly wave of shrapnel. Daniel hit Salvatore mid-chest, knocking the breath out of the old man as she drove them both to the sticky linoleum floor. She threw her arms over his head, curling her body into a protective shell over his frail frame. Deafening, rhythmic pops filled the diner. The sound was physical, punching into Daniel's eardrums and vibrating in her teeth. Sugar dispensers exploded. The leather upholstery of the booths ripped open, spewing foam like snow. Above her, the wall was chewed to pieces by flying lead. Daniel squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing into the floor, waiting for the burning, tearing impact of a bullet. She thought of Lily. Who is going to pay for her oxygen? Who is going to feed her? Salvatore lay completely still beneath her, his breathing shallow but steady. He wasn't trembling. "Stay down, ragazza," he whispered calmly into her ear, his hand gripping her forearm with surprising strength. From the kitchen, Brenda was screaming. The gunfire raged for what felt like an eternity, but could only have been 20 seconds. Then the distinct, wailing siren of a police cruiser cut through the noise. The shooting stopped abruptly. Someone shouted in a panicked voice outside. Doors slammed, and tires screeched as the SUV peeled away into the rainy afternoon. Daniel kept her eyes squeezed shut, her body shaking so violently she could barely breathe. The smell of sulfur and pulverized plaster choked the air. "They are gone," Salvatore murmured. He gently pushed Daniel off him, sitting up and dusting plaster from his ruined wool coat. He looked down at her. Daniel was covered in pie filling, coffee, and glass dust, her knees scraped and bleeding. Salvatore reached out, a heavy gold ring catching the dim, flickering light of a broken fluorescent bulb. He brushed a stray, damp curl from Daniel's forehead. His eyes were no longer those of a gentle grandfather. They were cold, calculating, and filled with a dangerous gratitude. "You are a very brave girl, Daniel," he said softly. He pulled a thick wad of cash from his pocket and dropped it on the table, which was miraculously still standing. "Forget you saw my face today." Before Daniel could comprehend his words, Salvatore Rossi stood up, leaning heavily on his cane, and walked out the back kitchen exit just as the police cruisers swarmed the front. The police interrogation lasted until 2 a.m. Daniel sat wrapped in a scratchy orange shock blanket in a sterile room at the precinct. Detective Reynolds, a burly man with nicotine-stained teeth and a tie that stopped inches above his belt, paced in front of her. "So you're telling me it was a random drive-by?" Reynolds pressed, his tone dripping with skepticism. "They just decided to light up a diner for the hell of it?" "I don't know," Daniel repeated for the dozenth time, her voice hoarse. "It happened so fast. And the old man you tackled? Where did he go?" Daniel remembered Salvatore's cold eyes and the command in his voice. "He ran out the back. Everyone was panicking. I don't know his name." It was a lie, and her heart hammered against her ribs. But instinct told her that telling this cop about Mr. Rossi was a fatal mistake. Reynolds stared at her, chewing the inside of his cheek. "You're a bad liar, Miss Jenkins. But I got dead gangbangers popping up all over the South Side, so I don't have time to hold your hand. Go home." Daniel walked the 6 blocks to her dilapidated apartment in the freezing drizzle. She checked on Lily, who was fast asleep, her breathing machine humming quietly beside her bed. Daniel collapsed onto the lumpy sofa in her uniform, too exhausted to even wash the dried coffee and plaster from her hair. 4 hours later, her alarm screamed. She dragged herself back to the Rusty Spoon. The front half of the diner was boarded up with plywood, yellow police tape fluttering in the morning wind. Brenda, looking 10 years older and sporting a bandage over a cut on her cheek, was unlocking the side door. "We're opening the back section," Brenda grunted, tossing Daniel an apron. "Insurance won't cover shit until the police report is filed. We need the cash, kid." Daniel nodded numbly. She needed the cash more than anyone. The morning was eerily quiet. Regulars stayed away, spooked by the plywood and the bloodstains on the sidewalk. By 10 a.m., Daniel had made exactly $4 in tips. She was standing by the coffee machine, staring blankly at the wall, when the light from the windows suddenly vanished, blocked by a massive shadow. 4 identical, gloss-black Cadillac Escalades pulled up, parking illegally across the front of the diner and blocking the entire street. Daniel's blood ran cold. They came back to finish the job. She reached under the counter, her fingers grazing the heavy iron handle of a frying pan. The diner door opened. 4 men walked in. They weren't wearing ski masks or tactical gear. They wore tailored Italian suits that probably cost more than Daniel's life insurance policy. They were massive, broad-shouldered men with hardened faces, broken noses, and cold, scanning eyes. One of them, a man with a scar slicing through his left eyebrow, calmly walked to the front door, flipped the sign to "Closed," and pulled the blinds down. Brenda emerged from the kitchen, a spatula raised like a weapon. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're—" "Quiet," the scarred man said softly. The sheer menace in his single word froze Brenda in her tracks. The 4 men fanned out, securing the perimeter of the small diner. They didn't look at Daniel. They were waiting for someone. The door opened one last time. He stepped into the dim light of the diner, and the oxygen seemed to instantly evaporate from the room. He was in his early 30s, tall and lethally graceful. He wore a midnight blue suit without a tie, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His hair was dark and styled, but his eyes, pitch black and utterly unreadable, were what pinned Daniel to the floorboards. He exuded an aura of absolute authority and violence, wrapped in terrifying sophistication. He didn't look at the damaged diner. He looked straight at Daniel. He walked slowly toward the counter, his leather shoes silent on the linoleum. He stopped 2 feet away from her. Up close, Daniel could smell his cologne. Bergamot, cedar, and something distinctly metallic, like ozone before a lightning strike. "Daniel Jenkins," he said. His voice was smooth, deep, and commanded absolute obedience. Daniel swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the hidden frying pan. "Who are you?" "My name is Felicity Rossi," he said, his dark eyes trailing over her bruised face, the scrape on her cheek, the exhaustion in her posture. "You saved my father's life yesterday." Daniel's breath caught. "Salvatore." I just reacted," Daniel stammered. "I didn't do anything special." Felicity let out a low, humorless exhale. 20 armed men from the Moretti syndicate unload onto a building. Grown men fled. Police hid behind their desks. But a 24-year-old waitress, drowning in $40,000 of medical debt for her sister at St. Jude's, throws herself into the line of fire. Daniel flinched. "How do you know about Lily?" "I know everything," Felicity stated, leaning slightly against the counter. He reached into his jacket pocket. Daniel tensed, but he only pulled out a heavy cream-colored envelope, sliding it across the counter. "Your sister's medical debts are cleared. The mortgage on your late mother's apartment is paid. Your rent is covered for the next 10 years. Daniel stared at the envelope, as if it were a bomb. I can't take this. I don't want Mafia money." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The 4 guards shifted, their eyes darting to Felicity. Felicity didn't blink. He leaned closer, invading her space, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a possessive, predatory intensity. "It wasn't an offer, Daniel. It is a closed transaction. You bled for my family. In my world, a life debt is sacred." "I don't belong in your world," Daniel fired back, a sudden surge of defensive anger overriding her fear. "I just want to serve coffee and go home to my sister. Take your money and your guards and leave." Felicity stared at her, an unfamiliar spark of amusement, and something much darker, flickering in his eyes. He wasn't used to being defied, let alone by a woman in a stained apron holding a hidden frying pan. You don't understand the board you just stepped onto, little bird, Felicity said softly, his voice a dangerous purr. The Morettis know someone shielded the Don. They don't know who yet, but when they find out, they will come for you. And when they do, your bravery won't save you. He stepped back, adjusting his cuffs. These 4 men are my elite. Matteo, Luca, Silas, and Enzo. From this second forward, they do not leave your side. They will stand outside this diner. They will follow you home. They will guard your sister's hospital room. You can't do that, Daniel yelled. This is a free country. You can't just occupy my life. Watch me, Felicity replied coldly. He turned toward the door. Make sure she eats, he tossed over his shoulder to Matteo, the scarred guard. She looks like she's about to faint. With that, Felicity Rossi walked out, leaving Daniel trapped in a gilded, terrifying new reality. The next 3 days were a psychological torture Daniel had never anticipated. True to Felicity's word, the 4 men became her permanent shadows. Matteo and Luca stood like gargoyles outside the Rusty Spoon, their sheer mass and tailored suits terrifying any customer who dared approach. Silas and Enzo followed Daniel on her walk home, driving at a crawl in an SUV behind her. Brenda was furious, but her anger quickly dissolved when Matteo handed her a stack of crisp $100 bills at the end of every shift to compensate for the inconvenience. The diner was empty, but it was making more money than it had in a decade. Daniel felt like an animal in a zoo. She tried ignoring them. She tried yelling at them. On the second day, she brought 2 cups of coffee out to Matteo and Luca in the freezing rain, her guilt overriding her resentment. They accepted the coffee with stiff nods, but refused to speak to her. Felicity did not reappear, but his presence was suffocating. Groceries were delivered to Daniel's door, expensive organic produce, imported meats, things she could never afford. When she tried to return them, the delivery boy looked terrified and ran down the stairs. On Thursday night, Daniel finished her shift, the silence of the empty diner ringing in her ears. She walked the 6 blocks home, Silas and Enzo's SUV trailing silently behind her like a hearse. She unlocked the door to her apartment. The heat was off again. She shivered, dropping her keys on the side table. "Lily," Daniel called out, shrugging off her wet coat. "I'm home. I brought some leftover soup." There was no answer. Daniel's stomach dropped. Usually, she could hear the rhythmic hiss-click of Lily's oxygen concentrator. The apartment was dead silent. "Lily!" Daniel yelled, sprinting down the narrow hallway toward the bedroom. She burst through the door. Lily was huddled in the corner of her bed, her eyes wide with sheer terror, a hand clamped over her own mouth. Standing in the center of the bedroom was a man Daniel had never seen before. He was rail-thin, wearing a faded leather jacket, his face pock-marked and twitchy. In his right hand, he held a suppressed pistol, the long cylindrical barrel pointed directly at Lily's chest. "Not another sound, Waitress," the man hissed, his voice like grinding metal. "You made a big mistake pulling a hero act for the Rossi family." Daniel's blood turned to ice. The Morettis. Felicity had been right. They found her. "Please," Daniel whispered, raising her hands, stepping slowly between the gunman and her sister. "Take me. Leave her alone. She's sick. She has nothing to do with this." The hit man smiled, exposing rotting teeth. "Orders are to clean the slate. No witnesses, no heroes. Don Moretti sends his regards." He raised the gun, aiming it at Daniel's head. Daniel closed her eyes. "I'm sorry, Lily." Crash. The bedroom window exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. A massive, dark figure swung through the shattered frame from the fire escape. It was Enzo. Before the hitman could pull the trigger, Enzo threw a heavy tactical knife. It sank deep into the hitman's shoulder, pinning him against the drywall. The suppressed pistol clattered to the floor. The hitman screamed, a wet, gurgling sound. Enzo didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, grabbed the man by the throat, and slammed his head against the wall with sickening force. The hitman slumped to the floor, unconscious. The front door of the apartment was kicked open with a thunderous crash. Silas rushed in, gun drawn, sweeping the apartment. Daniel fell to her knees, dragging Lily into her arms, both of them sobbing hysterically. The adrenaline crashed out of her system, leaving her violently nauseous. Heavy, hurried footsteps echoed in the hallway. The doorway to the bedroom filled with a terrifyingly familiar figure. Felicity Rossi stood there. He wasn't wearing a suit this time. He wore a dark, tactical sweater, his chest heaving slightly, his eyes blazing with a murderous, unhinged fury. He looked at the unconscious hitman bleeding on Daniel's carpet, then his gaze snapped to Daniel, huddled on the floor with her sister. The anger in his eyes vanished, replaced by an emotion so intense it made Daniel's breath hitch. It was pure, terrifying relief. Felicity crossed the room and dropped to one knee beside her. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gripping Daniel's shoulders. His touch was burning hot against her freezing skin. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice thick with a raw, primal edge. "Did he touch you? Did he touch her?" No, Daniel choked out, trembling uncontrollably. Enzo stopped him." Felicity let out a harsh breath, pulling Daniel against his chest. It wasn't a romantic embrace. It was fiercely possessive, a shield of muscle and warmth. Daniel was too terrified to pull away. She buried her face in his shoulder, smelling the bergamot and the metallic scent of impending violence. "I told you," Felicity whispered into her hair, his voice vibrating against her cheek. "I told you they would come." He pulled back, his eyes locking onto hers. There was no room for argument left in his gaze. The illusion of her freedom was officially dead. "Pack a bag," Felicity ordered, standing up. "Just the essentials, the medical equipment." Where are we going?" Daniel asked, her voice shaking. Felicity looked down at the hitman, his face hardening into an expression of absolute cruelty. "This apartment is compromised. You and your sister are coming to the estate. You are under my roof now, Daniel. And God help the man who tries to take you from me." Daniel looked at the blood on her floor, the shattered window, and the terrifying, beautiful Mafia boss who had just claimed her life. She realized with a sinking dread that saving the Don was the easy part. Surviving his son was going to be the real challenge. The drive north on Interstate 94 was a blur of flashing highway lights and suffocating silence. Daniel sat in the back of the armored Cadillac, clutching Lily's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. Felicity sat in the passenger seat, his broad shoulders tense, issuing low, rapid-fire commands in Italian into a burner phone. They exited Interlake Forest, winding through roads lined with ancient oaks and towering wrought-iron gates. When the Escalade finally slowed, it wasn't pulling up to a house, it was a compound. Heavy steel gates rolled open seamlessly, revealing a sprawling limestone manor that looked more like a European consulate than a home. Armed men walked the perimeter, their breath visible in the freezing Chicago air, accompanied by massive Dobermans. "Welcome to the cage," Daniel whispered bitterly to herself. Felicity's sharp hearing caught it. He glanced back through the rearview mirror, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "It's a fortress, Daniel. There is a difference. A cage keeps you in. A fortress keeps them out." The moment the SUV stopped, the doors were pulled open. Enzo and Silas were already there, having driven the medical equipment ahead. They ushered Daniel and Lily inside. If the exterior was intimidating, the interior was a masterclass in suffocating wealth. Marble floors echoed under their boots. Oil paintings hung on silk-panelled walls, but Daniel barely noticed the luxury. Her entire focus was on Lily, who was pale and wheezing, the stress of the home invasion triggering a respiratory episode. "Where is the machine?" Daniel panicked, her waitress instincts of managing chaos failing her. "She needs her Philips Respironics concentrator now." "Already set up." A calm, authoritative voice echoed from the top of the grand staircase. A man in a crisp white shirt and slacks descended. He carried a leather medical bag and had the steady, unbothered demeanor of a man who had seen worse. "Daniel, this is Dr. Harrison Sterling," Felicity said, stepping up beside her. "He was the chief of pulmonology at Northwestern Memorial before he went private for my family. He will be overseeing Lily's care." Dr. Sterling offered a kind smile. "I've got her, Daniel. We have a suite on the first floor retrofitted into a sterile environment. High-flow oxygen, the nebulizer, everything she needs. Let's get her comfortable." Daniel watched, paralyzed by a mixture of profound relief and deep, festering guilt, as Matteo and Dr. Sterling gently escorted her sister down the hall. For years, Daniel had fought tooth and nail, begging insurance companies and dodging collection calls just to keep Lily breathing. Felicity Rossi had solved her greatest terror in less than an hour. She owed him a debt she could never repay, and that terrified her more than the guns. "Drink this." Felicity was standing right in front of her, holding a glass of amber liquid. It was a neat pour of Macallan 25. "I don't drink," Daniel said, her voice shaking as the adrenaline finally crashed. "Tonight you do," Felicity commanded softly. He pressed the heavy crystal glass into her trembling hands. "Drink it, Daniel. It will stop the shaking." She took a sip. The whiskey burned down her throat, planting a warm fire in her stomach. She coughed, looking up at him. The harsh lighting of the foyer caught the sharp angles of his jaw and the deep, exhausted shadows under his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel asked, her voice cracking. "I saved your father on instinct. You paid my debts. We were even. Why drag me into this war?" Felicity stepped closer, the scent of his bergamot cologne and the lingering smell of gunpowder wrapped around her. "You think the Morettis care about even? To them you embarrassed their hit squad. You cost them the ultimate prize. They don't forgive, Daniel. If I had left you in that apartment, you and Lily would be dead by morning." He reached out, his thumb gently brushing a streak of dirt from her cheek. The touch was electric, sending a jolt straight to her chest. "You are under my protection now," Felicity murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly register that made Daniel's breath hitch. "And I do not lose what is mine." For the next week, Daniel lived in a state of suspended animation. The estate was beautiful, but it was heavily guarded. She wasn't allowed to step off the back patio without Matteo or Luca trailing 10 feet behind her. She spent her days in Lily's medical suite, watching her sister thrive under Dr. Sterling's care. The color returned to Lily's cheeks, and for the first time in years, she laughed without breaking into a coughing fit. On the 5th day, Daniel was in the vast industrial kitchen, trying to find comfort in routine. She had found a bag of flour, yeast, and fresh tomatoes, and was aggressively kneading pizza dough when the heavy wooden doors swung open. It was Salvatore Rossi. The Don looked different than he had in the diner. He wasn't wearing an overcoat, but a soft cashmere sweater. He leaned heavily on his silver cane, but his presence still commanded the room. "Ah, the savior of Booth 4, Salvatore said, a warm, genuine smile spreading across his weathered face. "The chefs told me someone was making a mess in my kitchen." Daniel wiped her floured hands on an apron she'd borrowed. I'm sorry, Mr. Rossi. I needed to do something with my hands. I'm used to working 12-hour shifts. Sitting around is making me crazy. Salvatore chuckled, pulling up a stool to the massive marble island. Please, sit with an old man. Daniel hesitated, then sat across from him. I owe you my life, Daniel Jenkins, Salvatore said, his dark eyes softening. And I know my son's methods of gratitude are overwhelming. Felicity does not know how to do things by half measures. He's treating me like a prisoner, Daniel said honestly, surprised by her own boldness. Salvatore sighed, looking down at his hands. Felicity lost his mother to a car bomb meant for me when he was 12. He pulled her from the wreckage. Since that day, he views the world in two categories: threats and things he must protect. When you threw yourself over me, you shocked him. He has never seen someone outside our bloodline risk their life for us. You became an anomaly to him, a precious one. Daniel swallowed hard, her heart aching unexpectedly for the ruthless man who had kicked down her door. Be patient with him, Daniel, Salvatore urged gently. The Morettis are closing in. There is a rat in my organization feeding them information. Felicity is carrying the weight of the family on his shoulders. He keeps you locked up because the thought of you bleeding for us again is tearing him apart. The tension in the Rossi estate snapped 2 nights later. Salvatore had called a mandatory gathering of the syndicate's capos and lieutenants. It was officially a dinner to celebrate his survival, but everyone in the house knew it was a trap. Felicity and his father were trying to flush out the mole. Daniel was told to stay in her room, but Felicity had sent up a dress, a deep, emerald green silk gown that fit her perfectly, alongside a note written in sharp, aggressive handwriting. In case you get restless. DR. By 9 p.m., the heavy bass of classical music and the low murmur of dozens of men drifting up from the grand ballroom became too much. Daniel's waitress instincts, the need to be moving, to be observing, took over. She slipped into the emerald dress, the silk pooling elegantly around her feet, and quietly walked down the sweeping staircase. She stayed in the shadows of the mezzanine, leaning against the cold marble balustrade, watching the room below. It was a sea of bespoke suits, cigar smoke, and dangerous men. Felicity stood near the massive stone fireplace, holding a glass of scotch. He looked devastatingly handsome in a black tuxedo, but Daniel could see the coil of tension in his jaw. Matteo and Enzo stood at the perimeter, their eyes scanning the crowd. Daniel watched the room, the way she used to watch the floor at the Rusty Spoon. You learn a lot about people when you serve them. You learn who is impatient, who is lying, and who is incredibly nervous. Her eyes landed on a man standing near the bar. He was older, with slicked-back silver hair and a tailored grey suit. He was laughing with another capo, but his eyes were darting rapidly toward the side door that led to the estate's kitchens. He wasn't drinking his wine. He was just holding it, and his right hand kept brushing against the inner lapel of his jacket. Daniel frowned. She recognized him from a dossier Felicity had left open on his desk earlier that week. It was Lorenzo, the underboss, Salvatore's oldest friend. Then Daniel saw it. A busboy, a young kid who looked entirely out of place among the hardened Mafia men, was pushing a cart of fresh glasses toward the side door. Lorenzo gave the kid a nearly imperceptible nod. The kid wasn't reaching for glasses. His hand was slipping under the white linen tablecloth of the cart. "Felicity!" Daniel screamed. Her voice ripped through the elegant murmur of the ballroom like a siren. Felicity's head snapped up to the mezzanine. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look around. The sheer terror in Daniel's voice was all the trigger he needed. "Gun!" Daniel pointed down at the busboy. Chaos erupted. The busboy whipped a sawed-off shotgun from beneath the cart, aiming directly at Salvatore, who was sitting in a leather armchair 10 feet away. But Felicity was already moving. He threw his heavy crystal Scotch glass straight into the kid's face. The glass shattered, throwing off the kid's aim. The shotgun went off with a deafening boom, blowing a hole the size of a dinner plate into the antique mahogany wall, just inches from Salvatore's head. Matteo and Enzo tackled the shooter to the ground before he could pump the action again. Men were shouting, pulling weapons. Lorenzo, realizing the hit had failed, drew his own pistol and aimed it at Felicity's back. "Drop it, Lorenzo!" The voice was Salvatore's. The old man was on his feet, his silver cane discarded, holding a massive, silver-plated revolver, leveled directly at his oldest friend's chest. The room froze. The silence was heavier than the gunfire. "You sold me to the Morettis, old friend?" Salvatore asked, his voice echoing with a profound, heart-breaking betrayal. Lorenzo's hand shook. "They offered me the north side, Sal. You're getting old. You're weak. You let a diner waitress live in the house." Felicity didn't hesitate. He unholstered his weapon in a blur of motion and fired a single shot. Lorenzo dropped his gun, clutching his knee, screaming in agony as he collapsed to the marble floor. "Take them to the cellar," Felicity ordered, his voice devoid of all human emotion. Both of them. Guards swarmed the room, dragging the bleeding Lorenzo and the sobbing busboy away. The remaining capos stood in stunned, terrified silence. Felicity looked up at the mezzanine. He found Daniel standing there, her hands gripping the marble railing, her chest heaving. Without a word to his men or his father, Felicity bypassed the stairs and took the servants' staircase, 2 steps at a time. He found Daniel in the upper hallway. She was shaking violently, the adrenaline crashing through her system just like it had in the diner. Felicity slammed into her, pinning her against the wall. It wasn't violent. It was desperate. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply, his massive frame trembling against hers. "You didn't stay in your room," he ground out, his voice thick and ragged. I saw him," Daniel gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to grip his broad shoulders. He was holding his jacket wrong, like a man carrying a concealed piece. "The cops at the diner used to do it." Felicity pulled back, his dark eyes blazing with an intensity that terrified and thrilled her all at once. His hands framed her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "You saved him again. You saved my father. You saved me," Felicity whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. The cold, calculating Mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man completely undone by the woman in front of him. I pay attention," Daniel breathed, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "Pay attention to this, Daniel," Felicity murmured. He didn't give her a chance to reply. Felicity crashed his lips onto hers. The kiss was aggressive, heavy with the adrenaline of surviving a firefight, and steeped in days of agonizing, unspoken tension. Daniel gasped against his mouth, but instead of pushing him away, her fingers tangled into his dark hair, pulling him closer. She tasted scotch, danger, and an overwhelming, fiercely protective devotion. For the first time since the bullets shattered the windows of the Rusty Spoon, Daniel wasn't just surviving. She was falling, and she was falling for the most dangerous man in Chicago. The morning after the shootout in the ballroom, the Lake Forest estate felt different. The stifling, museum-like silence was gone, replaced by the frantic, thrumming energy of a syndicate preparing for all-out war. Men in tactical gear patrolled the gardens openly. The gravel driveway was a revolving door of black SUVs. For Daniel, the shift was entirely internal. She sat in Lily's medical suite, watching her sister play a card game with Enzo, the massive, terrifying enforcer who had a surprising soft spot for Go Fish. Daniel's lips still buzzed from the memory of Felicity's kiss. It had changed everything. She was no longer just a debt to be paid. She was tethered to him, pulled into the gravitational orbit of a man who ruled by fear, but looked at her with absolute reverence. Felicity entered the suite, bringing the scent of cold air and black coffee with him. He wore a dark Henley shirt that stretched across his chest, a bruised knuckle the only physical evidence of the violence from the night before. He didn't look at Enzo or Lily. His dark eyes locked onto Daniel. "Walk with me," he said, the command softened by a slight nod toward the door. Daniel followed him into the cavernous library. The moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut, Felicity closed the distance between them. He didn't kiss her this time. He simply rested his forehead against hers, his hands gripping her waist. It was a gesture of profound exhaustion and deep vulnerability that Daniel knew no one else in his world ever saw. Lorenzo sang before he bled out, Felicity murmured, his voice a low rasp. Don Carmine Moretti is making his final play. He knows Lorenzo failed. He knows we are coming for him. He's liquidating his assets, bringing in heavy hitters from Detroit. The city is about to burn, Daniel. What does that mean for us? Daniel asked, her hands resting flat against his solid chest, feeling the steady, calming thud of his heart. It means I cannot keep you here, Felicity said, pulling back to look at her, his expression hardening. The estate is heavily fortified, but it's a known target. If they breach the gates with enough men, I can't guarantee your sister's medical equipment won't be compromised in the crossfire. Dr. Sterling has arranged a private, secure floor at an underground boutique clinic in the Gold Coast. It's off the books. Anonymous. You and Lily are moving there today. Daniel's stomach plummeted. And you? I'm going to war, little bird, Felicity said softly, his thumb brushing her lower lip. I'm going to cut the head off the Moretti snake so you never have to look over your shoulder again. 2 hours later, the transport was ready. They opted for a low-profile approach, a single, heavily armored ambulance for Lily and Dr. Sterling, escorted by 2 unmarked grey sedans. Matteo and Luca drove the lead car. Silas and Enzo took the rear. Felicity rode in the back of the ambulance with Daniel, his hand resting lightly but securely on her knee. The rain had returned, turning the Chicago expressways into slick grey ribbons. Lily was asleep, the steady hum of her portable oxygen concentrator filling the tight space. Almost there, Dr. Sterling noted, checking Lily's vitals on a monitor. 10 minutes to the secure garage. Daniel exhaled, leaning her head against the cold metal wall of the ambulance. She looked at Felicity. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were glued to the rear-view camera feed on his tablet, his jaw set in stone. Suddenly, Felicity's radio crackled. It was Matteo. "Boss, we have a problem. Black semi-truck merging aggressively from the left lane. It's pacing us. 2 panel vans boxing us in from the rear." Felicity's head snapped up. "Evasive maneuvers, Matteo. Break the box. Now." It was too late. The deafening roar of grinding metal drowned out the rain. The black semi-truck slammed into the side of the lead sedan, crushing the armored vehicle against the concrete median with a shower of sparks. "Matteo!" Daniel screamed as she watched the sedan crumple on the camera feed. Before the ambulance driver could swerve, the rear doors of the panel vans flew open. Men in heavy body armor opened fire with assault rifles. Bullets rained against the reinforced back doors of the ambulance like a terrifying, metallic hailstorm. "Get down!" Felicity roared, throwing his body over Daniel and Lily's stretcher. Dr. Sterling dove to the floorboards, the armored glass spider-webbed under the barrage, but it held. The ambulance swerved violently, tires shrieking as the driver tried to break free. "How did they know?" Daniel gasped, her hands covering her ears, the smell of burnt rubber and gunpowder seeping through the air vents. "You said this was off the books." Felicity pulled his weapon, his eyes burning with a lethal realization. It was off our books, but someone had to clear the transport route with the city. Daniel remembered the nicotine-stained teeth and the cheap tie from the precinct. Detective Reynolds, the cop who had interrogated her, who knew her name, who knew she had saved the Don. He was the secondary mole. He had sold their transport route to the Morettis. An explosive round hit the ambulance's right rear tire. The heavy vehicle fishtailed violently, spinning out of control. It slammed into the guardrail with a bone-jarring crunch, throwing Daniel into Felicity's chest. The engine died. The lights flickered and went out. Through the spider-webbed glass, Daniel saw dozens of armed men advancing on the crippled ambulance. "Silas! Enzo!" Felicity yelled into his radio. Static. The rear escort car was nowhere to be seen, cut off by the panel vans. Felicity looked down at Daniel. The ruthless Mafia prince was gone, replaced by a desperate man facing the end. He pressed a spare, heavy Glock into her trembling hands. "Listen to me," Felicity commanded, his voice dead calm despite the chaos outside. "I am going to open the side door. I will draw their fire. You take Lily and the doctor and run for the service stairwell 20 yards down the embankment. Do not look back, Daniel. Do you understand?" "No." Daniel grabbed his jacket, tears streaming down her face. "I am not leaving you to die on a highway." "You have to," Felicity said, kissing her forehead, a fierce, bruising goodbye. "Protect your sister." Before Daniel could stop him, Felicity kicked the side door open and rolled out into the pouring rain, firing his weapon in rapid, deadly succession. Gunfire erupted in a deafening chorus. Daniel heard men screaming, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the wet asphalt, and the terrifying, relentless pop of Felicity's pistol. "Move!" Dr. Sterling shouted, grabbing the handles of Lily's mobile stretcher. Daniel didn't freeze. The waitress who had tackled a Mafia Don to the floor didn't hesitate. She gripped the heavy Glock, pushed the ambulance door open, and stepped out into the slaughter. Felicity was taking cover behind a concrete barrier, pinning down 4 Moretti gunmen. But he was outgunned, and 3 more men were flanking him from the right, raising their rifles. He didn't see them. Daniel raised the Glock. She didn't aim. She just pointed and pulled the trigger, screaming as the recoil snapped her wrists back. She didn't hit anyone, but the sudden burst of fire from the ambulance distracted the flanking gunmen. They ducked, cursing. That 1 second of hesitation was all Felicity needed. He spun around and neutralized the 3 men with terrifying precision. But as he turned back, a sniper round from the overpass tore through the shoulder of his tactical vest. Felicity went down hard, blood spraying onto the grey concrete. "Felicity!" Daniel shrieked, dropping the gun and sprinting toward him, ignoring the bullets whizzing past her head. She slid to her knees beside him. He was pale, gasping for air, his hand clutching his bleeding shoulder. "I told you to run," he coughed, blood staining his teeth. "I don't follow orders well," Daniel sobbed, pressing her hands hard over his wound, feeling the hot, sticky blood pulsing against her palms. Suddenly, the roar of massive engines shook the highway. 4 black, armored Humvees crashed through the police barricades at the end of the bridge. Heavy machine gun fire ripped from the turrets, tearing the remaining Moretti gunmen to shreds. The cavalry had arrived. Salvatore Rossi, leaning out the window of the lead vehicle, watched with cold, calculating eyes as his men secured the perimeter. Silas and Enzo, bloodied but alive, sprinted from the rear to secure Daniel and Felicity. 3 weeks later, the war was over. Carmine Moretti was found at the bottom of the Chicago River. Detective Reynolds was arrested by federal agents on a tip mysteriously supplied by a shell corporation, his pension seized, his life ruined. The Rossi family had reclaimed the city, painting the streets with the blood of anyone who had dared to stand against them. Daniel sat in a plush armchair in the master suite of the Lake Forest estate. Lily was downstairs, laughing with Enzo as he taught her how to cheat at poker. The heavy oak door opened. Felicity walked in. His arm was in a sling, and he looked thinner, the edges of his face sharper. He walked slowly toward Daniel, stopping a few feet away. "The city is quiet," Felicity said, his dark eyes studying her face. "The accounts are settled. You are safe." Daniel stood up. She wasn't wearing an apron or a diner uniform. She wore a tailored black dress, her posture straight, her eyes clear. The terrified waitress was gone, forged into something harder by the fire she had walked through. Felicity reached into his pocket with his good hand and pulled out a leather dossier. He tossed it onto the coffee table between them. "New identities," Felicity said, his voice flat, completely devoid of emotion. "A villa in Tuscany. $10 million in a Swiss account. A private medical team for Lily for the rest of her life. You can take it, Daniel. You can walk out of those gates right now, and you will never see a gun or a guard or me ever again." Daniel looked at the dossier. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. Total freedom. Total safety. "And if I stay?" she asked softly. Felicity's jaw clenched. The mask of indifference cracked, revealing a man terrified of the answer. "If you stay, Daniel, you stay as mine. You step into the darkness. You sit beside me at the head of this table. You will never be a civilian again. You will be the queen of the Rossi syndicate." Daniel looked at the man who had shattered her life, paid her debts, shielded her with his own body, and bled on the asphalt to keep her breathing. Survival wasn't a calculated choice, and neither was love. She stepped over the dossier, closing the distance between them. She reached up, gently tracing the line of his jaw, avoiding his injured shoulder. "I like the coffee here better than the diner," Daniel whispered, rising onto her toes to press her lips against his. Felicity let out a shuddering breath, his uninjured arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He kissed her with a fierce, possessive hunger, sealing her fate in a world of violence, luxury, and unbreakable loyalty. The waitress had died on the floor of the Rusty Spoon. The queen had risen in her place. The line between ordinary life and absolute chaos is thinner than paper. Daniel Jenkins's story is a brutal reminder that heroism isn't planned. It is a split-second collision of circumstance and instinct. What began as a selfless act in a forgotten diner spiraled into an underworld saga of blood, loyalty, and an intoxicating, dangerous romance. She didn't just save an old man. She altered the power dynamics of Chicago's most lethal syndicate. Felicity Rossi demanded a life debt, dragging her into a gilded cage, but ultimately it was Daniel who conquered the monster. She proved that true power doesn't come from holding a gun, but from the grit to stand in the crossfire for those you love. In the end, the poor waitress didn't just survive the Mafia. She inherited it, proving that sometimes the only way to beat the darkness is to rule it.